The Strange Case of Spring-Heeled Jack. London, 1840. The fog clung to the cobblestone streets like a ghostly veil, muffling the sounds of the bustling city. Gas lamps flickered dimly, casting long, eerie shadows that seemed to dance and writhe with a life of their own. I had been a detective in this city for nearly 2 decades, but nothing could have prepared me for the terror that was about to unfold. My name is Inspector Harold Langston, and it was my job to keep the peace in a city where peace was a rare commodity. London was a breeding ground for crime, its narrow alleys and winding streets hiding secrets darker than the smog that hung in the air. But even in a city as grim as this, there were whispers of something far more sinister. A figure of legend that had begun to resurface in the most gruesome of ways. The first reports came in sporadically, dismissed by my superiors as the ravings of drunkards and hysterical women. They spoke of a man, or something resembling a man, who could leap over tall walls and rooftops with ease, leaving his victims with grotesque burns and deep slashing wounds. They called him Spring-Heeled Jack, a name I recognized from tales told to frighten children into obedience. But this was no mere story. This was something real, and it was my duty to stop it. The first body I encountered was that of a young woman, her eyes wide with terror, her mouth frozen in a silent scream. Her dress was singed, and her chest bore the marks of what appeared to be claws, sharp, deadly, and inhuman. I crouched beside her, my breath visible in the cold night air, and I felt the icy fingers of dread wrap around my heart. This was no ordinary killer. As I examined the scene, a peculiar scent caught my attention. A faint whiff of sulfur, like the brimstone from the depths of hell itself. My instincts screamed at me to leave, to run from whatever had done this, but duty anchored me to the spot. There had to be an explanation, something grounded in reality, even if my gut told me otherwise. I spent the following nights scouring the streets of London, questioning anyone who might have seen or heard anything unusual. The stories were all the same. A dark figure with glowing red eyes, a man who could breathe fire, who moved with impossible speed and agility. And then, just as quickly as he appeared, he would vanish into the night, leaving nothing but fear in his wake. My investigation led me to the darker corners of the city, places where even the bravest of men feared to tread. It was in one such place, an abandoned warehouse near the docks, that I first encountered him. The air was thick with decay, the walls crumbling with age. I entered cautiously, my hand on the hilt of my revolver, the only weapon I had against whatever monstrosity awaited me. The silence was deafening, broken only by the sound of my own footsteps echoing in the vast emptiness. And then, without warning, the temperature dropped, and I felt a presence. Something malevolent, something watching me from the shadows. My heart pounded in my chest as I scanned the darkness, my eyes straining to see what lurked just beyond the edge of the light. And then I saw him. He emerged from the shadows, his silhouette tall and imposing. His eyes glowed with an unnatural light, and when he grinned, I saw the sharp teeth of a predator. He was dressed in a dark, tattered cloak that fluttered around him as if caught in an unseen wind. But it was his feet that caught my attention. His boots, fitted with steel springs, giving him the appearance of a nightmarish jack-in-the-box. "Inspector Langston," he hissed, his voice a raspy whisper that sent chills down my spine. "You've been looking for me." Before I could react, he lunged at me with impossible speed, his hand reaching out as if to claw at my very soul. I fired my revolver, but the bullet seemed to pass right through him, as though he were made of smoke. In a flash, he was gone, leaving behind only the faint scent of sulfur and the echo of his maniacal laughter. I stumbled out of the warehouse, my mind reeling. I had come face to face with the legend, and I knew now that this was no ordinary criminal. This was something far darker, something that defied all logic and reason. I had to find out what, or who, had created this monstrosity before more lives were lost. But as I made my way back to the station, the memory of his eyes glowing with a hellish fire haunted me, and I couldn't shake the feeling that this was only the beginning, that the terror was far from over. As I stepped out into the night, the fog seemed thicker, the darkness more oppressive. Somewhere in the distance I heard the faint echo of a scream, a sound that would soon become all too familiar. For Spring-Heeled Jack was not done with London, and he was not done with me. I returned to the station that night, my hands trembling as I tried to make sense of what I had witnessed. The encounter with Spring-Heeled Jack had left me shaken, but I knew I couldn't let fear take hold. London was depending on me to put an end to this terror, and I would not rest until I had uncovered the truth. I spent the next few days combing through old case files and folklore, searching for any clue that might lead me to the origin of this monstrous figure. The stories were inconsistent. Some spoke of a demon summoned by a coven of witches. Others claimed Jack was a man who had sold his soul to the devil in exchange for unnatural powers. But one name kept resurfacing, whispered in the dark corners of the city: Dr. Erasmus Finch. Dr. Finch was a name that had once commanded respect in the scientific community. a man known for his groundbreaking research in the fields of chemistry and anatomy. But his obsession with the occult had led him down a dark path, and he had been ostracized, his name struck from the annals of respectable society. Rumor had it that he had continued his experiments in secret, delving into the forbidden arts in search of immortality. If anyone could have created a creature like Spring-Heeled Jack, it was Finch. I found his residence at the edge of the city, a decrepit manor house that seemed to sag under the weight of its own history. The once grand building was now overgrown with ivy, its windows dark and lifeless. The air around the place felt heavy, oppressive, as though the very ground was steeped in malevolence. I approached the front door, my heart pounding in my chest. The knocker was cold to the touch, and as I raised it, the sound echoed through the empty halls like a death knell. Moments later, the door creaked open on its own, revealing a dimly lit foyer. The stench of decay and rot assaulted my senses, making my stomach churn. "Dr. Finch?" I called out, my voice wavering slightly. There was no answer, only the sound of the wind whistling through the cracks in the walls. I stepped inside, the floorboards groaning under my weight. The walls were lined with old portraits, their eyes following me as I made my way deeper into the house. A chill ran down my spine as I realized that many of the faces bore a striking resemblance to Spring-Heeled Jack. Sharp features, cold eyes, and a grin that sent shivers down my spine. At the end of the hall, I found a door slightly ajar, a faint light spilling out from within. I pushed it open to reveal a room cluttered with strange devices and alchemical equipment. In the center of the room stood a large table, upon which lay the remains of a grotesque figure, half man, half machine, with metal springs embedded in its legs. Before I could take another step, a voice rang out from the shadows. "Inspector Langston, what an unexpected pleasure." I whirled around to see a man emerging from the darkness. He was tall and thin, his face gaunt and pale, with eyes that seemed to burn with a feverish intensity. Dr. Erasmus Finch in the flesh. "You've been following my work, I see," Finch said, a twisted smile playing on his lips. "I must admit I'm impressed by your persistence. What have you done, Finch?" I demanded, my voice shaking with a mix of anger and fear. "What is Spring-Heeled Jack?" "Ah, Jack," Finch mused, his eyes gleaming with something close to pride. "He is my greatest creation, a man who has transcended the limitations of mortality, imbued with the power of the ancient alchemists. He is the perfect predator, a being of pure instinct and unrelenting terror." "You're mad!" I spat, backing away as he stepped closer. "You've unleashed a monster upon this city." "Madness, Inspector, is a matter of perspective," Finch replied, his tone almost amused. "You see only the horror, but I see the future. A world where men like Jack are the rulers, the conquerors of a new age." Suddenly, the room grew colder, the light flickering ominously. Finch's smile widened as the shadows around him began to twist and writhe, forming into a shape that was all too familiar. Spring-Heeled Jack stepped out of the darkness, his red eyes glowing with malevolent intent. I raised my revolver, but Finch laughed, a sound that chilled me to the bone. "Bullets won't stop him, Inspector. He is beyond your understanding." With a speed that defied reason, Jack lunged at me. I barely had time to dodge, the creature's claws raking through the air where I had stood moments before. I fired a shot, but as before, it passed harmlessly through him, leaving nothing but a trail of sulphurous smoke. Jack advanced again, his eyes locked onto mine, his grin widening as he closed the distance. My heart raced, panic threatening to overtake me, but I forced myself to think. There had to be a way to stop him. A weakness. Something I could exploit. Then, out of the corner of my eye, I saw it. A large glass container filled with a strange, glowing liquid. It was connected to the machinery on the table, the fluid pulsing with an eerie light. Instinctively, I knew this was the source of Jack's power. As Jack prepared to strike, I aimed my revolver at the container and fired. The glass shattered, and the liquid spilled across the floor, hissing and steaming as it touched the air. Jack let out a terrible, inhuman scream, his body convulsing as the light in his eyes flickered and dimmed. But before I could react, Finch lunged at me, a knife in his hand. We struggled, the blade inches from my throat as we grappled on the floor. In the chaos, I managed to knock the knife from his hand and deliver a blow to his head, sending him sprawling. Gasping for breath, I staggered to my feet, only to see that Jack was still standing. But something had changed. The light in his eyes was fading, and his movements had become sluggish, almost mechanical. Whatever I had done, it was weakening him. But as I took a step forward, the floor beneath me gave way, and I plunged into darkness. I awoke in a cold, damp cellar, the air thick with the stench of mildew and rot. My head throbbed, and my vision swam as I tried to make sense of my surroundings. There were no windows, no doors, only the sound of dripping water and the distant echo of Finch's laughter. I was trapped, and somewhere in the darkness, I knew that Spring-Heeled Jack was still out there, waiting for his next victim. The cellar was pitch black, the only sound the steady drip of water echoing through the cold, damp air. My head throbbed from the fall, and as I struggled to my feet, I realized just how dire my situation had become. There was no way out that I could see, and my revolver had been lost in the struggle. I was alone, trapped beneath a house where unspeakable horrors had been born. I forced myself to breathe slowly, to focus, and to take in my surroundings. My hands searched the walls, rough stone slick with moisture, as I felt my way along. The air was heavy, oppressive, and with each step, I felt the weight of the darkness closing in around me. Suddenly my fingers brushed against something cold and metallic. I fumbled in the dark, tracing the object until I realized it was a rusted iron handle, the kind that might open a trap door or a hidden passage. Hope surged within me as I pulled with all my strength, and with a groan of ancient wood, the door creaked open, revealing a faint sliver of light from above. Climbing through the narrow opening, I found myself in what appeared to be an old forgotten laboratory. The room was cluttered with dusty tomes, strange instruments, and the remnants of alchemical experiments long abandoned. In the center of the room, a large book lay open on a pedestal, its pages filled with cryptic symbols and diagrams. The air in the room was thick with the scent of sulfur, and the eerie light from the cracked windows cast long, twisted shadows that seemed to dance with a life of their own. As I approached the book, a sense of dread washed over me. The symbols on the pages were unlike anything I had ever seen, a language that seemed to hum with a dark, unnatural energy. My eyes were drawn to a single passage written in a spidery hand. Through fire and shadow he was forged. By the hands of the damned he was bound. Only by the breaking of the circle shall his soul be freed. Underscore. The words sent a chill down my spine. They spoke of a ritual, a dark pact made in the pursuit of power. A power that had created the monster known as Spring-Heeled Jack. The circle, the passage implied, was the key to his existence, the source of his strength and the prison of his soul. I had to find the circle and destroy it. But where could it be? The answer, I feared, lay with Dr. Finch. With renewed determination, I searched the room, hoping to find anything that might lead me to Finch or the circle. It was then that I noticed a peculiar map pinned to the wall, marked with symbols that matched those in the book. The map showed a section of London, with a series of locations circled in red ink, each one a site where Jack had been sighted, or where a victim had been found. And at the very center of the map was Finch's manor. I knew what I had to do. If I could find the circle, I could break it, and perhaps, just perhaps, I could put an end to this nightmare. The manor was deathly silent as I made my way back to the main hall, my every step echoing through the empty corridors. The air seemed to grow colder with each passing moment, and the feeling of being watched returned, stronger than ever. My eyes scanned the shadows, searching for any sign of movement, any hint that I was not alone. As I approached the grand staircase that led to the upper floors, I heard it. A faint metallic creak, like the sound of a spring being compressed. My heart skipped a beat, and I froze, listening intently. The sound came again, closer this time, followed by the soft, almost inaudible whisper of footsteps. I turned slowly, my eyes widening in horror as I saw him. Spring-Heeled Jack, standing at the far end of the hall, his red eyes burning like embers in the dark. He was motionless, his head cocked to one side as if he were studying me, deciding whether I was worth the effort of killing. For a moment, neither of us moved. The air between us was thick with tension, the silence almost unbearable. Then, with a sudden, explosive burst of energy, Jack sprang forward, his boots striking the floor with a deafening crash as he leaped toward me. I barely had time to react. I turned and ran up the stairs, my heart pounding in my chest as Jack's inhuman laughter echoed through the hall. His leaps were impossibly fast, closing the distance between us with terrifying speed. I could feel the air shift around me as he drew closer, the scent of sulfur filling my nostrils. But I had a plan, a desperate, reckless plan. I reached the top of the stairs and sprinted down the corridor, skidding to a halt in front of a large wooden door. I threw it open and dashed inside, slamming it shut behind me. I was in a library, the walls lined with shelves filled with books and ancient scrolls. In the center of the room was a large circular rug, embroidered with strange symbols that matched those in the book downstairs. It was the circle, the source of Jack's power. There was no time to waste. I grabbed a nearby candlestick and set the rug ablaze, the flames quickly consuming the fabric. The symbols glowed a sickly green as they burned, and a deafening roar filled the room. A roar that seemed to come from the very walls themselves. Jack burst through the door, his eyes wide with rage as he saw what I had done. He lunged at me, but something was different. His movements were sluggish, as if he were fighting against some unseen force. The flames had weakened him, but he was still coming. Desperate, I backed away, searching for something, anything, that could stop him. My eyes fell on a large ornate mirror hanging on the wall. I grabbed it, swinging it in front of me just as Jack reached out to strike. His hand touched the mirror, and for a split second, his reflection twisted and warped, his features contorted into a grotesque mask of agony. Then, With a flash of blinding light, Jack let out a blood-curdling scream and shattered into a cloud of ash, dissipating into the air. The room fell silent, the flames extinguishing themselves as quickly as they had ignited. I stood there panting, the mirror still clutched in my trembling hands. It was over. Or so I thought. But as the last wisps of smoke curled through the air, I noticed something in the mirror. Something that made my blood run cold. There in the reflection stood Dr. Finch, his eyes filled with a madness that chilled me to the bone. And then with a twisted grin he whispered, "The circle is broken, Inspector. But the game is far from over." The mirror cracked, and as I watched in horror, Finch's reflection began to change, to morph into something monstrous. Something that looked all too familiar. His eyes glowed red, his grin widening as his body twisted and contorted until he stood before me. Not as a man, but as a new spring-heeled Jack. The truth hit me like a ton of bricks. Jack wasn't just a creation. He was a curse. A curse that could pass from one soul to another. A curse that now had a new host. And I was the next target. My heart raced as I stared at the cracked mirror. The twisted reflection of Dr. Finch morphing into the new spring-heeled Jack. The room seemed to close in around me. The air thick with the scent of sulfur and the lingering echoes of Finch's maniacal laughter. I knew now that this nightmare was far from over, and the realization sent a cold shiver down my spine. I had destroyed the circle. But in doing so, I had unleashed something far more terrifying. A curse that had now taken root in Finch, transforming him into the very monster he had created. The horror of it all threatened to overwhelm me, but I forced myself to focus. If I was going to survive this, I needed to think fast. The mirror, now fractured, reflected not just the room, but the twisted, shifting form of Finch as he completed his transformation. His eyes, once human, now burned with a hellish red light, and his body, once frail, had become muscular, his limbs elongated, with sharp claws where fingers had once been. His boots, those cursed spring-loaded boots, clicked menacingly on the wooden floor as he took a step toward me. "Inspector Langston!" Finch's voice rasped, no longer fully human. "You cannot escape the inevitable. The curse demands a host, and soon it will be you." I backed away, my mind racing. I needed a plan, and I needed it fast. The laboratory had been destroyed in the fire, and I had no weapons, no means of defending myself against the abomination that Finch had become. But then, my eyes fell on the book, the ancient leather-bound tome that had detailed the ritual to create Spring-Heeled Jack. There had to be something in there, some way to end this curse once and for all. As Finch continued to stalk toward me, I lunged for the book, flipping through its pages with trembling hands. The symbols and diagrams blurred before my eyes, but I forced myself to focus, to find anything that could help. And then I saw it. A passage hidden near the end of the book, written in the same spidery hand as before. "The curse of the Jack cannot be broken by fire nor by blade. Only the blood of the one who first summoned the demon can banish it, binding the spirit back to the abyss from whence it came. Underscore." My blood ran cold. Finch hadn't just created Jack. He had summoned him, using a dark ritual that had tied the demon to his very soul. And now, the only way to stop him was to kill him. Truly kill him, not just destroy his body, but to end his life by spilling his blood. But how could I get close enough? Finch, or Jack, as he had now become, was nearly invincible, his strength and speed far beyond that of any man. I needed a distraction, something to give me the chance to strike. I glanced around the room, my eyes settling on the shattered mirror. The fragments lay scattered across the floor, gleaming like shards of ice in the dim light. An idea formed in my mind. Desperate and dangerous, but it was the only chance I had. "Is this what you want, Finch?" I shouted, my voice echoing through the room.
"You want to make me your next victim? Come and get me!"
Finch's eyes narrowed, his twisted grin widening as he lunged toward me with blinding speed. But I was ready. Just as he reached me, I grabbed a large shard of the mirror and slashed at his face, the glass cutting deep into his flesh. Finch roared in pain, recoiling as dark, almost black blood oozed from the wound. But I didn't stop there. I grabbed another shard and threw it at the book, the pages catching fire as the blood-soaked glass touched them. The flames spread quickly, consuming the ancient text in a blaze of heat and light. Finch screamed, a sound that was no longer human but something far more primal, more demonic. He staggered back, clutching his bleeding face as the fire spread to the symbols on the walls. The very magic that had given him life now turning against him. This was my moment. I lunged at him, grabbing a piece of broken metal from the floor, and drove it into his chest, straight into his heart. Finch's eyes widened in shock and pain, his body convulsing as the metal pierced through his flesh and bone. But it wasn't enough. The curse was too strong, too deeply rooted. I needed to finish it, to end this horror once and for all. With a final desperate effort, I grabbed another shard of glass and sliced across Finch's throat, the blood pouring from the wound in a torrent. He gasped, choking on his own blood as the fire consumed everything around us. And then, with one last terrible scream, Finch collapsed to the floor, his body convulsing before finally going still. The flames flickered, then roared higher, and I knew I had only moments to escape before the entire manor went up in flames. I stumbled out of the room, coughing as smoke filled my lungs. The manor was a maze of fire and smoke, the walls crumbling as the flames devoured the ancient wood. I pushed forward, barely able to see, the heat searing my skin as I fought my way to the front door. Finally, with a last, desperate effort, I burst through the door and into the cold night air. I collapsed on the ground outside, gasping for breath, as the manor behind me was consumed in a towering inferno. I lay there staring up at the sky, my body trembling from exhaustion and shock. It was over. The curse was broken, the demon banished back to the abyss. Finch, Spring-Heeled Jack, was no more. But as I lay there, the distant echoes of that maniacal laughter still ringing in my ears. I couldn't shake the feeling that something had been left behind, something dark and malevolent that still lingered in the shadows of London. And then, just as I began to drift into unconsciousness, I heard it, a faint metallic creak, like the sound of a spring being compressed. My heart froze. Somewhere out there in the darkness, Spring-Heeled Jack still lived, and he was coming for me. The end.